Hey everyone. Hey Mark, how are you? So I'm just going to get started because we only have 20 minutes and I'm hoping to do some Q&A. So I'm going to talk today about Web3 and the rule of law. Big words. Hopefully we can break it down and make it simple. Here's the outline. We're going to talk about what is the rule of law. Why do we want it? Why is it something that's actually good? I'm going to talk about Web3 as the rule of law. I'm going to see how Web3 can be understood as, in some sense, the rule of law. And how and why there's demand for Web3 because there's demand for the rule of law. And then I'm going to talk about the relationship between Web3 and rule of law. And I'm going to talk about legal indeterminacy and kind of the need that we have for a stronger case for Web3. And then I'm going to wrap up and do hopefully some questions. So let's get into it. What is the rule of law? Well, firstly, let's talk about law. Law is about disputes. Law is about disputes between people or legal entities that can kind of try to change each other's behavior. If there was a world in which people couldn't try to change each other's behavior, law wouldn't exist. This is kind of, in my opinion, fundamentally what law is about. And that you can't talk about law without talking about disputes. Whenever you talk about rules enforcement compliance, what you're talking about is avoiding disputes with someone who's enforcing rules, or about a condition in which non-compliance leads to someone bringing a dispute to you. So law is fundamentally about disputes. And the disputes of humanity are diverse and super hard to, sum up. Legal order is the structure of disputes. So, when people have disputes, it's not structureless thing. It's not like people get to do whatever they want in a dispute. Disputes are structured by law, and specifically by legal order. Because legal order is just I'm defining as the structure of disputes. So the rule of law is basically the principle that legal order reigns over legal entities. So legal entities are things that can be kind of involved in disputes. So the rule of law says, look, the structure of disputes should reign over legal entities. We shouldn't have legal entities be more powerful than law. We shouldn't have legal entities be able to decide whatever happens in disputes. And, because at that point, it's kind of like the whims of that legal entity, whatever that legal entity ends up wanting for whatever reason, ends up being effectively law. And so, the idea of the rule of law is that instead of having the rule of kings, or of law enforcement, of lawmakers, of nation states, corporations, we have the rule of the structure of disputes. So none of these entities should be above the structure of disputes. No one should be able to do whatever they want in disputes, because if they can, then basically that leads to bad outcomes for other people if they abuse that power. So we really need actually legal order and the rule of law for scalable society, because simple hierarchy doesn't really work for large society. We can't always have common knowledge of like who is going to get a better way in a dispute. And so, just pure simple hierarchy where you have like a total order of everyone, and like if you're higher on the hierarchy, you get to win in fights, is not scalable. It's not the way human societies work. It's not the way we do disputes, because we don't always know we can't always know who should be higher in the hierarchy, and we don't want to live in a world where if you're higher in the hierarchy, you get to win all disputes, right? We want whoever's right in some way to win the dispute. And sometimes when two entities are having a dispute, one of them might be right on some arguments, and the other one might be right in some arguments. And simple hierarchy is not enough. We really want legal order and the rule of law to structure our disputes. We don't want to have a fascist dictator. We don't want to have anyone who is above the law, whether it's a lawmaker, a law enforcement, or a legal system. Because when anyone is above the law, there is no rule of law. This is kind of the definitional rather than an observational claim. Because their disputes are not structured by legal order. And what it means for there to be rule of law is that legal order structures disputes. So I'm going to say now that I'm going to give this kind of analogy of Web3 as the rule of law. What is Web3 all about? It's about security and decentralization. It's about resistant to attack. It's about being resistant to the mechanisms for bringing disputes that people have in society. It's about being resistant to adversaries, whether they be from legal systems or whether they be criminal hackers. Web3 is secure and decentralized. That's kind of the goal of Web3, so that it can be resistant to attacks and to disputes. Code is law. This means that code can't be disputed, right? You can't change the Bitcoin protocol, really. You can't have a dispute with it more than you can have a dispute with the stone. It's kind of the way the whole legal order is set up in Web3. We want to make things that are above dispute, that can't be subject to just the ruling of a judge or the whims of a legislature. Code is law means that protocol, not legal entities, rule. It means that no matter what legal entity you are, you can't mandate a change to the Bitcoin protocol. It's not up to anyone to bring a dispute to change these protocols, because code is law. That's our legal order. That's what we have right now. And so we really structure disputes that we have around code, around the protocols, to eliminate or prevent certain disputes. For example, there's 21 million Bitcoins. We all kind of know there's 21 million Bitcoins, and if you try to argue for another number, it's not going to go very well for you. Or if you try to interfere with the execution of smart contracts, it doesn't really go very well, because everyone kind of knows, the whole legal order is set up to eliminate disputes that try to change these things. So the whole thing is kind of motivated by this avoidance of legal and political capture. We have a real drive in Web3 to be secure against legal systems and political special interests, and that is the predominant legal order in Web3. Anti-capture paranoia is law. That's kind of what we have. And it's almost as if our main goal is to enforce the rule of law, as if to ensure that no one can bring a dispute and be above and capture the system to make it do whatever they want. The reason why, in my opinion, there's so much demand for Web3 is because there's demand for rule of law. Because we don't want anyone to be above the law, whether it's the US government, the Senate, the Congress, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's international organizations, whether it's international corporations, whether it's anyone. We're not born here out of demand for rule of legislatures at all. Not one bit. If anything, upset with the rule of legislatures creates demand for Web3. So to me, Web3 is the demand that we see here, and there's a lot of demand, is demand for rule of law. And that makes me ask, are we ruled by law or by by legal entities? Whether it's law enforcement, lawmakers, nation states, corporations, special interest groups, so on. Is the legal structure of disputes what rules, or is it legal interests of specific legal entities? The kind of hypothesis is that the reason why there's so much demand for this technology is because people believe in various parts of the world that there is no rule of law, that basically the legal systems have been captured by special interests, that lawmakers aren't doing their job, that nation states aren't really dealing with disputes responsibly. And it makes us ask, is there rule of law? And it makes us get really desperate and creating this really paranoia as legal, capture paranoia as legal order system, where we try to make sure that we don't get captured by any of these systems. And basically, I think because we want and we have demand for rule of law over rule of the sovereign. We don't want to live in a world where sovereign whims determine outcomes. We want to live in a world where we have a kind of decentralized structure of disputes that determines outcomes, where law rules as opposed to the whims of any legal entities. And so, Web3 I think is about really rule of law on a fundamental kind of level. But the relationship between Web3 and the rule of law globally is very indeterminate. We don't, legal indeterminacy around law governance is very, very deep. There's no way to really say what the future of legal order in Web3 or the relationship between Web3 and the established legal order is going to be. It really isn't determined. We in Web3 really see law and legal order as something that's inefficient and should be avoided, something that's captured by special interests, something that is kind of bad. We try to avoid law. We try to avoid politics too. And we, for the most part, see ourselves as above the law, above the rule of law, or outside the rule of law. We, code is law, isn't subject to law. It's not subject to dispute. Our main legal thinkers are legal skeptics. I put these names up there because they're, very publicly legal skeptics, but there's many of us, legal thinkers, some of us in the audience, who, are very skeptical of the operation of legal systems, and our main legal thought in the space is driven by skepticism of law and avoidance of law. And I don't think that being above the rule of law is fit for any normative law, any theory of how legal order should be. It shouldn't be that your buggy code is above the law. And I don't think it's really a defensible position from a normative point of view, because I think, security is not enough. Just avoiding capture is not really enough for a healthy legal order. We need much more from law than the avoidance of capture by special interests. We need more from the rule of law than just for it to exist. It needs to have some more properties, like it needs to maybe have good outcomes that it guarantees. It needs to not just minimize the ability for people to have disputes, but it needs to deal with disputes responsibly and to actually look at the substance of disputes and to understand that there are real cases that people might have for change in the legal order, and not to act like the legal order is set in stone, like the code that you wrote is set in stone, but that things are subject to dispute, and that nothing that we do is really above and outside the law. I think that would be a much more powerful position than our current we're above the law position. Not all rule of law is created equal, and buggy code is not equal to rule of law administered by people. Although arguably it could be less capture resistant, but capture resistance is one of many things that we want, and there's many, and we've got it, and we need, but we don't have almost any other legal principles or any other legal footing. I feel like I wanted to say something a couple of slides ago. Yeah, so Web3 is about the rule of law, but it really doesn't subject itself to dispute at all in almost any form. It's really, we have a lot of people who really just refuse to participate in disputes and refuse to manage disputes responsibly, and instead act like little dictators who are going to decide the rules and decide the future, and are really acting as if they're above the law in an ecosystem where the whole demand is created, in my opinion, or a lot of it, from the absence of the rule of law in existing legal systems. So I think we could improve our stance quite a lot. And I think we need to, so that we can thrive, legally speaking. Because today our legal footing is not adequate. We're at real legal risk. We're at risk of being captured. We're at risk of being banned. We're at risk of becoming obsolete because of projects with different legal footing than we do. We have a risk of not being, acceptable in the face of public legal systems, because we've set up our whole legal philosophy as if people are voluntarily using code in a private law setting, when really we're really public infrastructure, and we're setting the terms for public disputes. And there's also going to be lots of inefficient equilibriums if we refuse to manage disputes and if we just stonewall all disputes, because people, when they have legitimate cases, if we respond to them, will lead to better outcomes. And so I think we have a lot of legal risk and legal suboptimality in our current legal positions, because we are so radically paranoid about capture to the expense of all other legal considerations, and to the extent that we act like we're above the law, which I think undermines our legal footing and our legal position, really. So really, we have a lot at stake in governing our legal order. And we, for the most part, there's been a small number of minds that have kind of prepared the legal theories that we use to think about our responsibilities and the disputes that we have in cryptocurrency. And I think that there's a lot at stake and that we need to do better, both for Web3 and for the rule of law, globally speaking. So thank you so much for listening. I'm going to do a Q&A now.
If you can definitively achieve and definitively prove that you have unanimous consensus, should that override any code and any law?
No, I mean, even when you consent to something, it doesn't, remove all your rights to dispute with the thing you consented to later.
No, I said unanimous consensus. Everyone agrees.
Yeah,
there's
but
no more dispute.
unanimous consensus today doesn't mean that we don't have disputes in the future. I mean, consensus isn't a static thing. Consent isn't something that is just like exists once there's consensus, and then it binds you forever. It has to be actively maintained. So if there's consensus at every stage, then perhaps. Yeah, but notably, agreement is much less complex than dispute, and so I don't think we'll ever be able to agree on enough to cover and prevent all disputes. Because, yeah, I mean, so if hypothetically we could have consensus on how we manage all disputes, I mean, I'm not even sure that that's technically possible, but if, then maybe that could be used to prevent disputes. Cheers.
What do you mean by law, and how do you distinguish rule of law and rule of legislatures?
How do you distinguish rule of law and rule of legislatures? Well, it's empirically, basically the question is, can a certain legal entity do whatever they want and structure disputes however they want, or are they bound by the disputes they have with other people? So if, for example, a legislature can really do anything without it being considered illegal, then, or without someone bringing a dispute to them in a way that makes them change their behavior, then I think then there isn't rule of law. However, this is kind of definitional. Observationally, it's quite hard because people don't really try the crazy stuff that would be required to prove that you're above the law. They really only live in like a kind of limited, much more legal scope. And so, it's hard. It's not necessarily easy unless people are doing things like acting really like they're above the law to tell whether a rule of law exists. But what you can tell is kind of the culture and to what extent people believe that law operates and to what extent people believe that the powerful just get their way. And that, is kind of like maybe a sign that can maybe be a tell. But I imagine that people who really, deal in politics and power and law have an idea of who has what positions in legal systems, but I certainly don't. I'm just a researcher. And so a priori, it's, the only way to really observe is to see someone try to structure the legal order, to try to take over and be above the law.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. When you say that we want to avoid capture, or we want this, we want that, who do you refer to as we? Is it all people, or there are some that don't want this? How do you distinguish between the two? I'm not thinking about people specifically. I'm mostly thinking about like the kind of prevailing culture that I observe, and it, I think that there's lots of reasons why people want to see blockchain technology be captured in various ways, because of their own interests, be it economic interests, legal interests, political interests, and I think they're really diverse. But there's also lots of people who want to see blockchain governance not be captured at all.
Give me a mic. Oh, hello. Thank you so much for that, Vlad. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up now. But